Slavery in the Americas. The history of slavery in the Americas, especially regarding Black people, is tragic and deeply intertwined with the European colonial enterprise. Millions of Africans were forcibly taken from their homes and sold as slaves in the Americas, starting in the 16th century. They were exploited for their labor, forced to work on plantations, especially in the Caribbean, Brazil, and the American South, growing crops like sugar, tobacco, cotton, and coffee. This system was built on racial hierarchies that dehumanized Black people, treating them as property rather than people. The brutal conditions, lack of freedom, and denial of basic rights created one of the darkest chapters in human history. Slavery in Europe. In Europe, while the African slave trade was growing, the history of slavery was a bit different. Slavery in Europe existed in earlier times, such as in the Roman Empire and during the Middle Ages, but the form of slavery that we commonly associate with Black Africans in the Americas was not as widespread in Europe itself. However, European elites did own slaves, including white slaves. These were often people from Eastern Europe, like Slavs, hence the term slave, who were captured or traded into forced labor. Also, after the fall of the Roman Empire and throughout the Middle Ages, the concept of serfdom emerged in Europe. While serfs were not technically slaves, they weren't considered property, their lives were still extremely hard. They were bound to the land they worked on and were controlled by feudal lords, giving them very little freedom or rights. Their labor was exploited in much the same way as slavery, even if legally different. Exploitation of the poor. The economic systems that arose in both Europe and the Americas often kept the poor in a state of survival, with little hope of upward mobility. In Europe, the poor were sometimes exploited through feudal systems, and in the early capitalist era, factories and mines often employed the poorest people in terrible conditions, paying them just enough to survive. In the Americas, poor European settlers or indentured servants, who were typically white, were also exploited, working for a period, usually a few years, to pay off their passage to the New World. While their conditions were often better than enslaved Africans, they were still subject to harsh treatment. Free labor ideals and capitalism. The rise of industrial capitalism in the 18th and 19th centuries brought about the idea of free labor, which, at least on paper, offered workers the right to sell their labor in exchange for wages. However, in practice, many workers, both in Europe and the US, were still being exploited. While they,